Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Simon. I'm from Analog Anorak and I've got my production team with me. So I'm starting to live the dream. I've retired and during a pretty stressful job, one of the things that kept me sane was collecting records. And it's finally a chance for me to take stock of what I've got and talk about them and talk about them potentially to somebody who's interested. I'm wanting to talk about one of the earliest classical records I picked up. I found a little bit of a treasure trove of classical records and read a little bit about it and learnt a bit about Decca records and managed to find quite a few copies of Ravel's L'Enfant et le Sortilège, and I ended up choosing a relatively late re-release of this on Decca's Ace of Diamonds, and later on I picked up a mono version of it as well, and partly the reason is that the artwork is just so lovely with the original package. But I want to really talk about many aspects about this record, and probably to start off, just some of the background. It's by Ravel, and it's probably certainly the more easy to get into opera. He only did two. Well, I think he did a really early one as a student, which is incredibly long and pretty dull. I've got that on CD and I've tried to make my way through it, but the two really important ones are very short. There's a version over here which was released on Decca. This is the other one, and it's nowhere near as interesting as L'Enfant et Sortilège. I would definitely say it's a great opera, L'Enfant et le Sortilège, for so many different reasons. The music was done fairly remotely, with the libretto I think was certainly influenced by, if not written by, the French writer Colette. And it's really interesting, not just musically, but the content, because it's about a boy who has an absolute violent hissy fit when his mum tells him off and says he's not going to get any tea, and he smashes up his room. And he's also been really quite cruel to animals. He goes on this destructive riot and then sort of settles down post violence, and magic starts to happen, and the objects in the house turn into living creatures, and they have a rather annoyed set of talks with him, to say the least. And the second act, it opens up into the garden, where the creatures in the garden start talking and singing, and they're also not at all impressed with him. He ultimately saves himself through kindness, and there's a theme, a two-note theme, which appears in Ravel's work in some other parts. It's just two notes, and it's maman, and he was deeply attached to his mum, and why this is so interesting is certainly from my background, because I came from psychiatry, psychology, and I worked ultimately with the elderly, but one of the other areas that I could have easily gone into was child psychiatry and child development. And there's all these kind of theories about what's called object relations theory, and this is really interesting. How it's about empathy, anger. Yeah, really interesting content-wise, but also musically, it's great. A lot of opera you can struggle with because it's certainly on Decca. It's normally on 3 different records, 6 sides, quite heavy going sometimes, and instead you've got this just 2 sides and this sort of procession of different musical soundscapes coming on with all the different characters. Great variety, and yeah, I think I would strongly recommend it as one of the easiest operas to get into, and it's kind of shown with its sales. The L'Enfant et le Sortilège on Decca, it's been one of the ones that's been re-released so many times, and I think you can still get it in stereo on Speaker's Corner, which is nice because you've got the original artwork. But as I said, I went a slightly different route because my own kit, it's a sort of Swiss Army knife type kit, and it involves me being able to play 78s, mono as well as stereo, and so it kind of makes sense that I'm in a lovely position where I can go through the mono versions as well as the stereo versions, and they're a lot cheaper, and this is a little secret, they were better looked after. The guys who are like us in those days, in the sort of 50s, they were like the Decca engineers were a little bit skeptical about stereo. They were quite happy with hi-fi mono, and they were getting great results. And because of this, I think you've got a better chance with mono to, usually for about £20, sometimes £5, to get some really beautifully looked after records. Possibly sometimes through neglect. I think maybe some of these collectors then moved on to stereo and kind of neglected their mono. But it just enables you to have other options apart from the usual one, which is to get a repressing, but that limits your choice because it's only the real classics and stunners that tend to get released, because not many people buy early classical re-releases. They're much more into all the cool stuff like the John Coltrane or Miles Davis or stuff like that. So there's not a lot of money to be made in it. So they're obviously only going to choose a few things. So it just enabled me to have a wider choice. And there's not that many people collecting mono. I'll go and talk a bit now about these records. I think it probably makes sense to talk about the mono version first, because it was the version that came out when this was recorded by Ernst Ansermet was the conductor. Orchestra Suisse Romande was his own orchestra, and this was all based in Geneva in Victoria Hall, which has great acoustics. And at the time, acoustics of the venue were one of the real USPs of Decca recordings. They'd got the system together, but before the Neumann mics came on the scene in the 50s, they were kind of limited by the quality of their microphones. What was happening at this time? It was the sort of autumn of 1954. There'd been a sort of trial with the stereo equipment earlier that year that had gone very well. So this was during a session where they decided stereo was definitely viable for the future and they wanted to explore that. But at the end of the day, the mono was where the money was come from. And there was a really good guy doing the actual recording side of things. His name was Gil Went, and I'm a big fan of his, and I'm probably the only fan of his in existence. Well, you know, if you're a Gil Went fan, let me know. I think there's no chance of that. But he'd been recording at Victoria Hall with Ansame and a few other people coming in because of the wonderful acoustics, and he'd really built up an understanding and a knowledge of how to do mono there. What Decca did with mono around the 50s was very different from what Mercury did around the 50s with when they started doing hi-fi mono. Mercury was very purist with one single microphone in the perfect spot in a hall, which was normally roughly above the conductor, but it varied from location to location. Whereas Decca had a mixer which was bringing in various different microphones geared for the sections, and so they were using multiple microphones and utilizing this to pull together a version rather than the very purist Mercury style right at the beginning, particularly with the Kubelik recordings. So this is my version of L'Enfant et le Sortilège, and you would never believe that this was, I mean, the cover is is awesome. You would not believe that this is nearly 70 years old. It really shows that something like this, an SXL stereo, goodness knows what that would cost. But it is this magical artwork which really beautifully complements the magic of the recording, and it's got all, as you see, all the characters, particularly animals, with all these different versions, and it's one of the reasons why if you want to get a stereo version, I think you can probably still get a speaker's corner, although it does depend on supply. You probably might need to get it second hand. The cover is great, isn't it? But obviously, you know, covers. So what we've got here is I'll probably bring in some more some cut-ins, but we've got the golden orange LXTs, and these are a little bit tricky to play. Certainly, although you can play mono records on with a stereo system, because these are early and they've got very deep grooves. Occasionally you can get lucky, but a lot of them, the much smaller stereo records, fall down the groove and really pick up a lot of 70 years worth of dirt. You know, even after record cleaning, it can be a problem. And really, the best results can be achieved through having a setup with a mono switch. That can definitely help, but a dedicated mono cartridge really helps. I've got an entry-level Miyajima, which is lovely, and it's very hard to get the right mono needle, which is 1mm. The 0.7, certainly for this one, it's fine. Some of my orange and golds, you definitely need a 1mm. but this certainly plays beautifully. And so I think what I find is the mono version has got some great qualities about it. The actual voices, they're clearer. They've got a much stronger quality because we're talking about very early stereo, beautiful stereo, but well early in the day. So I think this is kind of my time travel version. If I want to be sent back, kind of Doctor Who-ish, to try to get into that experience, that the mono for me, it's got a certain quality that is just lovely. So because it kind of picked the choice of the microphones. They could use lots of different microphones, and it was almost like a kind of blend of whiskey. They could bring this in through trial and error over the years to make a really lovely sound. And this sort of was years in the making, and it was really nice. So that is my go-to. I think it's one of Gil Went's great recordings that he made at the time. I think the actual producer was one on this session was one that he'd worked with for a long period of time, Victor Orloff, who pretty soon after this jumped over to EMI to do similar work. But of course we've got a star as well, and a slightly forgotten star, and he's a guy called Roy Wallace. And I think one of the things that spurred me on to do this record is starting to talk about Roy Wallace, because he's just as important to Decca, to audiophile classical music as Ken Wilkinson. He is the pioneer of stereo, and he'd done this an initial trial session which was good, but this is something else. This recording, I think it's the first time that Decca in stereo bottled magic. It's just, and it's really early, because they had no intention of releasing any of these records. I think it was about 1960 where this finally came out on stereo. It wasn't until about 58 that the stereo records were actually available. Why Roy Wallace is so important. He was a crucial part of pulling together the stereo system for Decca. He outside of Decca, he'd been working in an engineering firm which was involved with all kinds of things, but had resurrected some ancient BBC equipment from before the war, experiments in binaural sound, and expanded on that, got a system going, really quite primitive. But the good thing is Decca saw the potential, not just in that kit, which they wanted, but they saw the potential in Roy Wallace, and that they really needed him to take this further. And he did. He went into Decca Studios, got all the newer kit. I'm sure he had a whale of a time, and he rebuilt everything with that newer kit, and he solved a problem with the microphone setup with a system that's become a legend, and it's the Decca tree, which is a setup of 3 microphones on a really tall boom stand, one pointing forward to the orchestra a bit further ahead than the other microphones, and 2 sort of other ones, one pointing out to the left of the orchestra, one to the right, and they're relatively far apart, and they ultimately found that suspending this in a similar position to the Mercury sweet spot that they found really produced a lovely stereo sound. Also some of the early stereo trials, the disappointing thing was the center image. But the 3 mics solution, particularly this pushing it a bit further forward, it created this really pleasant sounding, clear defined center image. When they were doing these initial experiments and during this recording session, they were using these directional microphones from Neumann M49s, and they're very, very clinically sharp. And this is what's probably one of the reasons why people love the stereo in this record, and it is really good. Compared with the mono, it doesn't quite have that quality with the voices, the presence of the voices, the presence of the location. But as far as early stereo, this is awesome. And if you look over the shoulder here, I've got these Decca collections. What's great about all of these boxes is they've not only got seminal recordings from different stages, but they've also got the really invaluable booklets, all of which of these 3 major contributions from Michael Gray, the music writer. And because he put in so much work, it's the reason why really we know what actually happened, because he managed to get in at a time where audiophiles were starting to get interested in these recordings again. But I think Decca had been bought up, the studios had been sold off. There was no strong sense of legacy, and really big difference between EMI and Abbey Road and everything like that. It was a really vulnerable time. And what happened, not just with Michael Gray, but other people as well, there were interviews carried out with some of the Decca staff. They managed to get permission to look into the Decca archives and find all these notes about the recording setups, and that's kind of how we know more about how the magic was achieved. I'm really glad I did get round, because I didn't buy the white analog box at the time, because I got most of these records on vinyl. But certainly as far as this session, L'Enfant et le Sortilège, there was something really interesting that Michael Gray wrote in the notes, which was Roy Wallace decided to record the actual vocalists on the stage with another Decca tree. I guess he'd obviously built another one since the initial one. So he had one Decca tree set up for the orchestra, but he had the luxury of the same sort of stereo setup. He was having a trial with recording the vocalists in a similar way. And so there's kind of 2 stereo setups combined, and there's so much else going on. I mean, the Swiss Romande Orchestra are on top form. There's also, when I bought this record, it was the first record with where I came across Susan Danko. I've been a huge fan of hers ever since then. She's got a lovely distinctive voice, really well captured on this recording. Yeah, I suppose I haven't actually shown you the recording I've got. Yeah, it's you can sort of see um, the difference. When Ace of Diamonds came out with the re-releases, they didn't resurrect the artwork, and I can kind of understand why they did it. It is a very different philosophy from how re-releases are done now, because this is kind of a repackaging, whereas the priorities for places like Speaker's Corner is to resurrect things exactly as they were. So we've got this really disappointing sort of 60s, 70s artwork. It's not as bad as some of the artwork, but it's... I think I bought this for £5, and what is really why I got it is the actual vinyl. It's a late release. It's one of the Dutch pressings so it's post 1980 where Philips, I think it was Polydor Philips, they bought up Decca. And what was going on at that time is they were still using the mastering that was being carried out in England, but the actual pressings had moved over to Holland, and so and initially the quality, it's a little bit hit and miss, but what on the plus side is when you come across something that's really good, it's using much more modern cutting lathes, very precise, and it's a really interesting when it works well. You've got the very early valve equipment, but without the limitations of the all valve SXLs that are highly prized but a little bit hit and miss. You can get beautiful magical ones, but yeah, sometimes you end up kissing a few frogs, and so there, you can get very disappointing poor quality Dutch releases, but when you get a good one like this one, it is lovely, and I would probably guess the Speaker's Corner one has the slight edge on this, but this is a true Decca release. The actual record mastering is by a guy called Ted Burkett, who's one of the two gods of mastering according to all the lists and everything like that. He's G on the dead wax. I've certainly not wanted to go overboard. I've never bought several £100 SXLs, and if you just want the music, which is fantastic, I would. You don't need, if you don't need the package, the beautiful artwork. This is really good. I think why I really wanted to talk about this record is it is this first time where there were real signs of what could be achieved by stereo recording, even with a pretty primitive setup as the first sort of incarnation of the Decca tree. Although Roy Wallace is a little bit, to say the least, in Ken Wilkinson's shadow, I think this was the real genesis of what could be achieved, and one of the reasons why the Decca tree is a living legend, because it's still used in a more sophisticated incarnation as an option for recording, especially the large-scale orchestral recordings, particularly the soundtracks for epic movies. I got the chance I had the Disney subscription to look at the documentary about Abbey Road. I mean, obviously it was mainly about the Beatles, which is fine by me. They did show John Williams when he started doing the sessions for the dubious early Star Wars trilogy, but sort of recorded the music at Abbey Road, and yeah, it was great. I was, oh, there's a Decca tree. It was lovely to see. So I think that I've managed to enjoy myself rambling about L'Enfant et le Sortilège. There's probably loads that I wanted to cover, but that's probably enough. I notice Midori down there, she's nicely asleep. So I hope you've managed to make it this far. So I'm going to be doing more chatting about classical music. I did originally plan to do a top 10 Roy Wallace recordings, and yeah, I had to go at that, and that, that was awful. And but I have got a few clips, because Midori was definitely the most interesting thing about my attempt to do a top 10. But I'm going to shove a few bits of content on my channel. Yeah, so thanks a lot, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye. This delivered a dazzling early stereo recording of Ravel's one-act opera L'Enfant et le Sortilège. For the singers, he replaced additional spot mics with a second Decca tree. Coppelia was available in a very classy double album box set, but my go-to, oh, Dory,